Innovation extends supply curve, sorry. I'm Shree, Vikas. I work at ConocoPhillips. I'm Director of Market Intelligence and Business Analysis there. Today, this session that we have would explore how innovative extraction technologies, big data analytics, standardization, etc., have enabled energy firms to survive, adapt, and evolve while exploiting new resources. We'll talk about how different innovations have come about in the industry in the last so many years. A little bit about energy innovation. Energy innovation has various flavors, sometimes incremental, sometimes disruptive, and they work in all the different value chain, production, energy delivery, and consumption. U.S. federal government has studied the impact of new technologies on unconventions for a long time. And many, Mike and others, and Bob, I know for sure they have done a lot of work in this area and in many others as well. If you look at private sector, individual innovation from George Mitchell proved to be quite disruptive in shales. Really help unlock the vast potential of shale resources. This gave ideas to others to understand technology, process tools, techniques, and how to figure it out and do commercially. That's what industry has done last so many years. And today, industry is really involved in operational innovation as to how we can keep reducing the cost of supply of that unconventional resources in an environmentally friendly manner. So that was the overall context of this innovation, energy innovation session. We have very distinguished panelists who have developed technologies, worked on various data-enabled innovations, and provided inputs to policymakers for energy and environmental technologies and innovative research. You will hear from them on a variety of different ways that they have supported this area. They will discuss how such innovations can be shaped not by just entrepreneurs or large companies, but also by federal governments, and how they have all played a role in the last so many years. And hopefully, we'll come out of the panel with a better understanding of how all these different innovations and technologies efforts and policy efforts can deliver products and services to address our environmental and energy challenges, not just demos. I thought about how we can develop these solutions which can really be innovative, disruptive, and can really help the sector in a most compelling manner. So what we would do is we'll go into order. We'll have first Bob Kleinberg come and present. And the way we would do it is we would have each of them present about 15 to 20 minutes. I'll open up for a few questions right after their remarks if you have any burning questions. But most of the questions we'll take at the end. Bob is going to start the session. He is adjunct senior research scholar at the Center of Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and also a non-resident senior fellow at Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. Bob has been with Schellenberger for 30 years. He was a senior research fellow, one of a dozen, I guess, out of over 100,000 people. And he had developed technologies, patents, all kinds of things on energy innovation and technology. It lasts his illustrious career at Schellenberger. He has authored more than 100 papers and holds 38 US patents. He'll start us on the topic of energy innovation and talk about how revolutionary shale oil and gas industry has been, and compare this revolution with other industry-changing innovations. Bob, yours.
Well, thank you, Shree. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm Bob Kleinberg, now with Columbia University, Boston University, as you just heard, but just retired from 37 years with Schlumberger, where I did technology development. What I'm going to talk about in the next 15 or 20 minutes or so is sort of an overview of tight oil innovation. So one question that's arisen the last couple of years is whether innovation is driven by low oil prices. And you know, as I'm not an economist, but you economists were blessed with a natural experiment to test that hypothesis. From the 1st of July 2014 to February 2016, the price of crude oil dropped by about 75%. Rig counts, and this data is for the Permian Basin, but it reflects basically all the North American tight oil plays, Bakken, Eagle Ford, and so on. Rig count dropped around 70% in these plays in that year and a half. And so that is a great opportunity to see what happens to production. And in fact, to the surprise of everyone, including OPEC, which engineered part of that enormous price decline, production in Permian continued to increase. In the other major basins, in Bakken and Eagle Ford, it increased for a while, sort of peaked out and then started declining. But in Bakken, for example, at the end of the year and a half, the production was the same as in the middle of July of 2014. So production held up remarkably well in the face of this enormous decrease in oil price. So some of this is described in a paper which is mentioned at the bottom of the slide that came out in Energy Economics just in January. People looked at this and said, wow, innovation must be driven by low oil prices. And indeed, here's what OPEC had to say about it. In their World Oil Outlook in October of 2016, they said the resilience of supply in the lower oil price environment caught the industry by surprise, particularly tight oil in North America. And whereas this was a great natural experiment for you, it was really their worst nightmare because based on break-even costs in 2014, they expected as soon as the price of oil dropped below 60, that those pesky American frackers would drop out of the market and take 5% of oil production out of the market. That did not happen. And the price dropped all the way from 100 through 60 to below 30, and still North American oil pouring into the market. So it was a bad day for OPEC. Very bad day. So what about this resilience in supply? So people then started scurrying around looking for possible explanation, and a very favorite explanation that one saw in exploration and production company investor presentations, that was picked up by trade journals like the Oil and Gas Journal, for example, was, okay, it was because of innovation. And here's a very typical quote from 2016 Oil and Gas Journal, U.S. shale resilience, a product of innovation, CEO said. So that was sort of the story that was out there. Now, okay, so from my perspective, I am sitting at that time in arguably the world's premier location for upstream oil and gas innovation, the Schlumberger Research Laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'm looking around, you know, and yeah, we're working really hard. But our development cycles are not 6 months or a year. They are decadal, and we'll talk about that in a while. So I'm thinking, what kind of innovation are they talking about? It's certainly not coming from Schlumberger. And we are actually the ones that are doing the fracking, so, okay. So that made me think about the sort of types of innovation. And I sort of broke it down into four classes. First is process and efficiency improvements. This is basically people learning to do their job better. When you come into a new field, you don't know the geology, you don't know what bits to use, you don't know what drilling fluids to use. The frackers really don't have a schedule worked out for how much water, how fast to pump the water, and what frack fluid additives to use. So all this is learning while doing, and it goes on all the time. It's historic in our industry and in many industries. And it continues independently of business cycles. People are going to be learning to do their job better and better no matter what the oil is selling for, because that's what engineers do. So the second category is what I call technical improvements, which are innovative, but they don't require significant R&D investment. And these too continue irrespective of business cycle. And I would put in that category things like pad drilling and superfracs. Superfracs are more water, more sand, longer wells, tighter fracture initiation points, what I call even more brute force. Again, this is a matter of, let's go try it. The longer wells seemed to work last time, let's make it even longer. Type reasoning, hey, that's perfectly good, great, go for it, guys. We don't care what the business cycle is doing. People are naturally going to be doing these field experiments and getting better and better at it. And we're still not quite at the end of that process, but I think we must be plateauing out, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Third category is major technological inventions, which require substantial R&D resources in order to be brought to market. This is what Schlumberger does. Examples, three-dimensional seismic survey, formation evaluation, and finally, there are the very rare industry-changing innovations that profoundly affect oil supply in a way that even 3D seismic did not. And the premier example from the 20th century was the development of secondary oil recovery by water flood or reservoir pressure maintenance. That basically changed the entire face of the industry. That happened again in this century with the advent of the combination of horizontal well construction and staged massive hydraulic fracturing. That was not a product of incrementally improving things. That was really people going and doing field experiments over decades to make that happen. And that's a long story by itself. I discussed some of these in a new paper I've just finished. It's currently in preprint, but hopefully published soon. And you can see me if you're interested. Okay, so just to see, sort of to substantiate this idea that these sort of process and efficiency improvements or any everyday innovations that continue through business cycles. This is data from the Energy Information Administration. I think a contractor did it, maybe ARI, but it was in a EIA wrapper. Basically looking at well cost on the vertical axis in millions of dollars from $0 to $10 million per well. And the horizontal axis is time from 2006 to 2015, which was the range of data for this study. What they found is that at first, and this is for standardized well design, at first well costs went up, peaked, and then went down. The interesting thing to look at is, when did the peak occur? It occurred in 2012, which was right in the middle of a historically almost unique period of high and very steady oil prices, which lasted from 2011 to mid-2014, where oil stayed above $100 for 3.5 years, and boy, those were the good old days for those of us in the industry. Nonetheless, we saw that because of these process of improvements that occur independent of business cycle, we see this first rise and then decline of well cost, which is explained in the paper I referred to. So having nothing to do with business cycles. Now here's, if we want to talk about major technological innovations, things which require research and development investments, this is a pretty good example of rotary steerable drilling, actually introduced by a German geophysical drilling project, government-sponsored project, KTB. Some of you might remember in the late 80s. They actually devised the first true rotary steerable drilling concept. They, were using it for years, finally picked up by the industry, who was finally convinced that this was interesting, and Agib and Baker Hughes were pioneers on the commercial side. More years went by before they had something they could do a field test with, a pilot, and then even more years before it was fully commercialized. Basically, the development cycle was 15 years. And this is by no means unusual, and many of these development cycles, which I document in the paper, are much longer. The 3D seismic was multi-decadal income. So these things are long compared to the business cycles that we're used to see in the oil and gas industry. So in fact, it's interesting to compare innovation landscape between our industry, the upstream oil and gas industry, and other people. So in petroleum, we have a severe mismatch between business cycles and development cycles, as I think I've suggested. Partly because petroleum markets are unusually volatile. In fact, we exclude gasoline from the core consumer price index because gasoline prices are always going up and down compared to the cost of other goods. We also have a problem of a combination of front-loaded capital expenditure and substantial geological risk, which discourages the use of untried innovation. And I can tell you, I am a victim of this way of thinking. I've had borehole geophysical instruments that clients would refuse to use because they didn't want to spend the rig time doing science experiments unless they were absolutely convinced that it would help them. And no, you're not going to try your thing. You've got to do a real sales job, and that can be hard when you don't have real field data, which you're trying to get. And even giving away the jobs wouldn't work. So it's a very conservative industry for good reason, because it's a high-risk industry. Okay, let's compare that to some of our other industries in our economy. How about consumer electronics and software? Well, development cycles here are like maybe a year, maybe, 2 years max. And you have a customer population that is biased toward novelty. I mean, how many of your friends are just happy to run out and buy the latest, $1,000 smartphone or something, the new box, just to try it out. So you've got a lot of bias toward novelty, which we do not have in the oil and gas industry, I can assure you. Let's compare with pharmaceuticals. Development cycles are really, really long, just like in oil and gas. Could be decadal, multi-decadal. The difference is that the market conditions are fundamentally more predictable. So, if you're working on an Alzheimer's drug or a cancer drug, you actually really don't care what the business cycle is going to be 5 years from now because people are going to buy it. So we are in an unusually difficult innovation landscape. I'm going to end with just a few observations that I must say I find puzzling, and I'm just going to sort of throw it out for people to think about and maybe get some feedback. The first is this data set, which comes from Rystad, which is a very good energy consultancy. Many of you are probably familiar with them. Showing a break-even point of oil in various tight oil plays in the US, Bakken in red, Eagle Ford orange, Permian Delaware in light blue, and then Permian Midland in black. And you can see that during that wonderful period of oil price stability from the beginning of 2011 to mid-2014, the break-even point, which is the basically cost per barrel, all in, including leases and exploration and so on, blah, blah, was sort of gently going down for most of the plays during that period of oil price stability, but still we're getting better and better as we delineate the plays. Permian Midland coming down a bit faster. Once we get into that period of oil price collapse, then break-even point dropped a lot faster, mostly because basically the operators wrung profits out of Schlumberger and our competitors. That was mostly it. Now, okay, fine. So we know that's a known story. I'm not going to dwell on it. I'm over it. But what's happened since 2016 is puzzling, and I'm not quite sure how to understand it, but it looks like break-even points have flattened out in sort of $35 to $40 range. Now, people are still innovating. I mean, you look at investor presentations from our major, US tight oil companies, and they show they're doing better, well costs going down, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, the Rystad compilation shows sort of a flattening. And so my question is this because we've run out of easy innovations, or are incremental innovations compensating for declining asset quality? I mean, we are very heavily exploiting the sweetest of the sweet spots, and we still are. That's got to come to an end, and we've got to, at some point, we've got to move to tier 2. And we're not there yet, but even within tier 1, I'm sure there's differences in quality, and we may be pressing up against quality limits. I don't know. But here's some more evidence that's also sort of, I found astonishing. This data is from SafeRock. They looked at, I think, the drilling info data. This is a single operator in the Permian. I'm not going to tell you who the operator is, but they are a premier operator. They are one of the very highest rated, sort of technology leaders. And again, what we see, the vertical axis is average barrels of oil equivalent per foot of lateral at 6 months of production. Okay, so it's a constant, it's a strange measure, but it's one that's constant over the data set. The horizontal axis, again, is date ranging from September 2014 to October 2017. That to me, I mean, you data guys can look all you want. That to me looks kind of flat-ish. So what's going on here? I mean, this is in a period where, again, we've been told there's been a lot of innovation, but we are not seeing a lot more production per lateral foot. Now we're seeing more production per well, for sure, because people are drilling longer wells. But we're not seeing more production per lateral foot. And again, I'm talking about a premier operator. So again, I'm a bit perplexed by this. And have we run out of easy innovations, or are we compensating for incrementally declining asset quality? I don't know. But I just want to sort of leave you with those questions, really. This is who I am, how to get in touch with me, and certainly happy to answer one or two questions, and I'll turn it back to Shree.
Thanks, Bob. If you have any burning questions right now, you ask Bob, otherwise we'll wait for at the end of all the presenters.
I assume the break-even costs that you've got there are your full cycle break-even costs that you've written about before, right?
Yeah, the numbers would be consistent with that, sort of $35 to $40 a barrel. Although I did recently see a $95,000 per acre lease sale in the Permian, which would not fit in that budget, but I think that was very exceptional. Yeah. Anybody?
Just maybe one more quick one. On your almost last statement there, are you saying that more and more sweet spots are being discovered?
No, I'm saying they are being depleted. We are out of discovery mode.
There's new ones that are not happening. I mean, they've already been assessed pretty well, and we're moving.
No one's doing exploratory drilling now. That's off the table. Yeah, which is part of the reason why the industry has become apparently more efficient.
Just something to point out, 17 and 18 costs have been rising also. So it's been like rising 10%. So that's part of it flattening too. So
yeah, that's right. And that's basically the service companies basically recovering profitability. I mean, it's not a charity. So, yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
Thanks, Bob. All right, let's move to the next presenter. Mike Godec. Mike is the VP, Vice President at ARI, where he prepares assessments of sequestration capacity and economic potential associated with geologic storage in oil and gas fields, deep saline aquifers, and coal seams. He has researched energy environment nexus throughout his career. The longer I know Mike, and he has studied environmental policy, technology, economics, and innovation, and how they have played an important role in energy industry transformation. Personally, for me, I started my career under him. He gave me my first job out of college. I learned a lot under his mentorship. Thanks, Mike, for everything. Prior to ARI, he directed the oil and gas practice at ICF International. And he has been there for a long time, and now at ARI. His presentation today will explore several areas of technological advances including environmental innovations impacting the industry. And he will also touch on this shale revolution, and he will talk about how it's not an overnight sensation and how it was over 30 years in making. All right, so Mike, all yours.
Okay, thank you, Shree, for the kind words. You know, I gave him his first job, but I wish I was making what he's making now. So we do get even at some point. I'm going to talk a little bit about technology innovation and its role in expanding the U.S. oil and gas resource base and its potential. And I'm going to build on some things that Bob said and look at it in some ways and from a different perspective as it relates to shale gas and tight oil, and then also go and look at other industries and other applications too. How did you go forward? Okay, so I'm going to talk about technology advances in shale resource exploitation, including tight oil. I'll talk a little bit about how technology advances are improving the potential for recovering more oil out of existing conventional fields. Talk a little bit about environmental technology and how environmental developments in technology to protect the environment have helped to also stimulate additional oil recovery and economic oil recovery. And then talk a little bit, just briefly, about kind of the role of the various entities in continuing to achieve technology development. So building on what Bob said, with shale gas, what changed the game was the ability to take long horizontally horizontal well wells and stimulate them extensively and develop a flow path in a reservoir that's tighter than the concrete in your driveway to produce oil and gas out of that kind of rock. I started working in the shale gas area in 1983. And people thought I was absolutely out of my mind. You're going to produce oil and gas out of that crap? No way. No way. It ain't going to happen. But what changed the game is you can create permeability in a reservoir that doesn't otherwise have it, and create flow through that permeability and produce oil and gas, and today at massive quantities. But important to know that that overnight success was 30 plus years in the making. The U.S. Department of Energy, the Gas Research Institute, were doing extensive research on shale gas development back in the early 80s, trying to kind of get there. And here's a copy of a report actually written in 1978, looking and documenting on what the R&D programming for unconventional gas would be at the U.S. Department of Energy. Similar plans were done at the Gas Research Institute at the time, which no longer exists. And then people started saying, well, maybe in this Barnett thing, this might work. And it took George Mitchell, who needed to sell gas under contract obligations that he was not going to meet otherwise, to say, I'm going to try some stuff. That everybody thinks is crazy, but I'm going to see if these slickwater kind of fracks can work. And lo and behold, they did. So when we think about innovation, it builds upon often, and I'm sure years and years and years of research to finally say, aha, we got it. So we got to be careful about, this overnight sensation of shale gas and tight oil is not. It's something that's been going on for a long time, and we just kept working it. However, new technologies are certainly making recovery efficiencies better in this world. Here's just an example of Range and how they're using machine learning to dramatically improve their productivity and their ability to predict productivity based on machine learning and data mining kinds of techniques. So technology is a continuum that's continually developing, and you continue to use it, and now we're using these massive computers to really understand more of what's going on in the reservoir, and using the data that we got Whereas, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, a lot of the early stuff was, let's just try this and see what happens. Okay, that didn't work. Now let's try this and see what happens. Now we're trying to say what's working and why, and we have statistics to help us really get a better understanding of that. Another important development that I think tends to get overlooked is really how environmental requirements and environmental considerations have driven us to productivity improvements that may not have happened otherwise. The whole idea of drilling, multiple wells from a single pad was really driven by environmental concerns. So we didn't want to have a bunch of small pads all over the place. Maybe we can reduce our footprint of oil and gas operations by drilling lots of horizontal wells from a single point. And lo and behold, that has resulted in substantial reductions in costs and improvements in productivity by doing that, but primarily driven by environmental considerations. But also, the other flip side of it is these improvements in technology reduce impacts themselves. The fact that we can drill faster and more efficiently and get these wells done and completed much more quickly means that surface impact of the drilling operations, the time you're there with all the trucks and all the things that cause concern, is reduced as well. So there's this synergy between environmental requirements and technology improvement and productivity that I think we tend to forget. We always complain about those damn regulations, but in fact, oftentimes those requirements have led us to do things that have improved our productivity and our profitability. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about CO2 enhanced oil recovery, injecting CO2 in the ground to recover residual oil. This is not the shale gas, this is different than the whole shale gas thing. But how can you get more oil out of the ground? Basically, very simply, it involves injecting CO2 in a supercritical state into the subsurface, becomes miscible with the oil, you produce the oil and water out, and you get oil that would otherwise be left behind as a result of the water flooding, the secondary recovery that was talked about before. And in general, you can get almost as much oil, and maybe even more, from the CO2 enhanced oil recovery that you got from the secondary recovery. It's a way to get more oil out of existing fields in a much more profitable way. And, oh, by the way, we can inject CO2 to do it, and CO2 lives in the ground, and we address, or begin to address the climate issue. We estimate in the US there's about 624 billion barrels of oil in place in the United States, of which we are only recovering a small fraction. We're leaving 2/3 of the oil, over 400 billion barrels, in the ground because of the limitations in current technology. We believe much of this left behind oil, over 284 billion barrels, is technically favorable for use in the application of CO2 enhanced oil recovery, and this resource is distributed widely across the United States. There's plenty of opportunity to take CO2 that would otherwise go into the atmosphere, inject it back into oil fields, leave the CO2 behind when you're done, and produce more domestic oil. And we're getting more and more of that oil out due to advances in technology, or what we term in many of our studies, next generation technologies. Scientifically based advances in foams and other kinds of things, extending EOR applications to offshore, extending EOR applications to tight oil. There's some people doing research right now, can we get more out of tight oil, where you're only getting 5 to 10% recovery now. Boy, if you get another 5 to 10% recovery by injecting CO2 into the Bakken, wow, that's a lot of stuff. I'm going to talk about 2 particular technologies I think or applications of technology that I think are relevant to this, and I could talk about a lot more, but Shree's only given me 15 minutes. He didn't want me to right now. So one is what's called recovery of oil in the residual oil zone. Back in the early days, people would drill their logs, and then when they got to the oil-water contact, they would say, that's the end of my reservoir, the rest has been swept by water and it's no longer recoverable. It's residual oil that I can't get. Well, what happens is that residual oil in below that oil-water contact, or where we use the transition zone and then the residual oil zone, is literally oil that had been swept through tectonic changes and other things by water over geologic time. It has the same characteristics as a water flood swept oil zone. In fact, in many cases, it's better geologically and in terms of reservoir characteristics. but you just can't get it out, except for injecting a miscible fluid like CO2 to help improve that recovery. And in just a few areas of Texas and the Permian Basin, you're getting more production out of this residual oil zone than you do out of the main pay zone. And it's doubling kind of the resource potential for enhanced oil recovery in the Permian Basin, or could very well do that. Now, the other interesting thing about the residual oil zone is that it doesn't only exist below the main pay zone of the existing fields, but it exists in extensive fairways where there is no main pay zone. There is just the residual oil zone. A tremendous resource opportunity for enhancing recovery of oil in a play that's been developed and under development for, 100 years. And we're finding as much oil in this residual oil zone that we used to think was there to start with when we first started looking at this. Tremendous, tremendous opportunity to both produce a lot of oil and put a lot of CO2 in the ground. And I'm going to skip here just to kind of get to this point. I mean, when you take kind of the onshore potential, you take offshore Alaska, you take near miscible, you take these residual oil zones in just a small percentage of the areas that we've looked at, that's another 100 billion barrels of economically recoverable oil at $80 oil and kind of conventional prices that we pay for CO2. But the other important point, to get that 100 billion barrels, you're going to need 32 billion metric tons of CO2 if you want to get after that. CO2 that in most cases would otherwise be emitted to the environment. And if you believe in climate change contributing to that problem. If you don't believe in climate change, it's still CO2, it's a commodity that could produce a lot of oil. It's good no matter what. One of the things one needs to do when they inject CO2 in the ground in order to certify storage is to monitor and determine that that CO2 is staying in the ground where you put it. And so there's been a lot of DOE-funded research projects associated with EOR fields really monitoring the plume and the CO2 and the pressure and where's it going, is it going where I want, and it doesn't make sense to do. Well, what happens is people started putting all this monitoring and all these diagnostics in the oil field, and then we began to say, hey guys, why don't we use that same monitoring to help improve the efficiency of this flood? Make sure the CO2 goes where we want it to go, which is where the oil is, not where it generally wants to go itself without intervention, to where the oil is not. And so this research to verify storage is contributing to improved efficiencies on oil recovery way above what conventional wisdom 20 years ago said, you can only inject so much and you're just not going to get any incremental oil out. No, if you know what's going on down there and have a good handle on what's going on, you can get a lot more oil out and you can put a lot more CO2 in. And so kind of a win-win in all respects. So I think what my concluding takeaways is one, technology developments are not overnight things. What changed the game in shale was 30 years in the making, and I think you can say that for a lot of technologies. You've got to do the work, you've got to do the homework, you've got to invest, you've got to depend on people like Schlumberger to kind of take the risk to see if this works or not. But also there's a very fundamental role for US government to be at the front end of a lot of this. Invest in the kinds of things that Schlumberger is not quite ready to do yet. And so, when we say government should be involved in R&D, well, I would disagree with that. The evolution of technology to respond to environmental requirements has also resulted in substantial productivity improvements in oil and gas production. And the synergistic approach of advances in technologies for CO2 storage have also resulted in improved CO2 EOR efficiencies that, again, mutually beneficial both to the production of hydrocarbon resources as well as to storing CO2. And there's no reason that can't continue to apply to tight oil, to the offshore, to the ROZ, and even to shale gas and coal and methane production if we develop and continue to enhance those technologies. But finally, both public and private support is needed for these future technology developments to continue. So with that, I am done, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions real quick. So the first thing is, you said the CO2 was miscible, but then it stays, so it's not being produced, right? So what happens to the
Okay,
CO2?
what happens, good question. What happens, and I didn't go through, but you inject the CO2 in the ground, and then some of it comes back out. But no matter how hard you try, you can't get all of it back out. A lot of it gets stuck in the
It
reservoir.
becomes carbonate, or what?
It's caught in pore stains, it becomes residual, some of it precipitates out, lots of different things happen, some of it gets dissolved in the water. And so if you think about it from a perspective of, so you buy some CO2, you inject it, you recycle some of it, you buy a little bit more, and you keep doing that over and over again. But by the time an EOR flood is done, pretty much all of the CO2 that you originally required to do this flood remains in the reservoir. It just, you can't get it out, people are trying, and you can't get it out. Similarly, I think you can then begin to use that infrastructure to pressure up that reservoir, put even more in once you're done, to actually get even more into that reservoir. And we've done some studies recently that shows that the CO2 that you could put into the ground for EOR with a co-optimization of storage and oil production, you put as much CO2 in the ground as associated with production of the oil, including combusting of that oil. It becomes a net sink for CO2, even counting the combustibility of the oil.
Good, because that leaves the second question, which is, where are you going to get all that damn CO2?
From?
Well, I know there's in the atmosphere, but you
No, from
pipelines.
the power plants, from
So, but you're going to have to build pipelines.
you're going to have to build pipelines, you're going to have to build infrastructure, but a lot of the CO2, if you go back to that map, a lot of the CO2 that's being emitted into the atmosphere is in the Texas, Gulf, Louisiana Gulf Coast area. Lots of EOR potential there.
You use existing pipelines.
You can use it, there's a pipeline network that's there, and you'll have to expand it. There's also a big pipeline network that's taking natural CO2 from Colorado and southern Colorado and New Mexico and bringing it down to the Permian Basin where there's a huge amount of CO2. People have proposed building pipe, and that's a 300-mile, 350-mile pipeline. So it's not like it's a, from the Ohio River Valley down into the Texas Gulf Coast or the Permian. So you will require the development of pipeline networks that connect sources to sink at scale. But you do that, and you don't have to worry about the one source, one sink kind of thing, but you have kind of a mechanism. And then you can use these natural CO2 reservoirs kind of like natural gas storage, just like kind of your load management. Because power plants don't always run, oil fields don't always run. How do you match up supply and demand in a reasonable way? So that's, it's not nearly as extensive as U.S. natural gas pipeline network, but it will require an effort to. And states are working right now developing incentives and corridors and other things to begin to facilitate this to happen.
I know you noticed you didn't show us a preliminary estimate of the cost curve, your full cycle cost curve, and maybe it's too early.
I mean, we have cost curves. We have lots of cost curves. Those big numbers were at $85 and about $30 a ton for paying for CO2, which is kind of what you pay now. Usually CO2 is indexed to oil price. There is no one economic value. There is a continuum. There is economic resources for CO2 recovery at below 20, lots in between 30 and 40, much more between. So there's a continuum there. And people continue to produce fields once they're done. I mean, all the fields that are operating in the Permian Basin were supposed to be shut in 25 years ago, and they're still pumping oil at steady rates. So it's
I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
So the first comment is thank you for talking about the history of the development of shale, because I always talk about public and private partnership, and I think this is a great example of that. I talk about that with my students. But my question is, I'm a little, or maybe it's a comment as well. So I'm a little concerned about the gathering public support for a technology like this, because even when we talk about fracking, it's a pretty controversial issue. And in that case, we're injecting water into the ground, which once you've injected it into the ground, it might be fairly stable. But when you're injecting gas into the ground, some kind of gas, whether it's carbon dioxide or any other type of gas, I'm concerned about the pressure and how stable or unstable it might be. So that's what I'm concerned about. And, I'm concerned about the safety issues. Have you thought about, so maybe here comes my question. What are the safety concerns that you have about this? Have you thought about the safety issues?
Well, I mean, that's that whole slide talking about monitoring. The slide here is intended to deal precisely with that. Is it staying where we think it's going to stay? Now, two things. One is those structures that we've are injecting the CO2 in, that held oil and gas for millions of years, for geological time, and it hasn't leaked out. Pretty good seals. Now, you do have holes because you've drilled wells into it. You're going to need to monitor those wells to make sure that you're not leaking. Most EOR floods have been characterized for 25 years. We have a pretty good idea of what's going on in the subsurface, and we know where the faults are and where the fractures are, and we can tend to avoid that. But you also want to operate an EOR flood at kind of a constant pressure. That's how you get the rock. You're going to inject at a pressure, and so you're performing that whole project at kind of steady state pressure that is well below the reservoir fracture pressure. So you're not going to be cracking up into the surface. So through proper management, you have hundreds of wells in these fields that you're monitoring temperature and pressure and composition and everything. An EOR flood does not want to get CO2 to go out of formation. That's a bad EOR flood. You want to make sure it's going where you think it's going to go. So operationally, they're designed to minimize risk. That doesn't mean there's no risk, and I think you have to monitor and be sure that that's happening. There is now a new law under the Internal Revenue Code that's going to give you tax incentives for the secure geologic storage of CO2. I can assure you the IRS is going to be wanting to make sure that if you're going to get credit for source CO2, that you have a good plan in place to monitor and verify that CO2 is staying. So there is no risk, but I think you put mechanisms in place to monitor what you think the risks are, and then have contingency plans for what you do in case some of those risks materialize in your worst nightmare. And that's how these operating lines work.
Yeah, we'll have more questions at the end. Let's move on to our third presenter. He is Scott Sanderson, principal in Deloitte Consulting, and he's a digital leader in oil and gas strategy and operations practice. He has more than 25 years of experience helping oil and gas companies define and execute strategies and operational improvement across a variety of sectors. He is a man with varied experience. He has been an independent oil and gas operator before, and also as an investment banker before working in Accenture. In Deloitte, sorry, wrong company. He will also talk about data-driven analytical techniques and how they have been disruptors in all aspects of energy value chain, not just in oil and gas sector. So, Scott.
Thank you, Shree. Thanks, Mike and Bob, and thanks everybody for giving me some time to visit with you here today. I do a few of these every year, 3, 4, maybe 5 at the most, and it gets a little daunting. I'm used to being the least accomplished person on the podium. Shree, you forgot to mention that to add to Bob's 36 patents, I add precisely 0. Very, very. 38. 38. I'm shortchanging it back, right? Look at that. But yes, we want to talk about innovation in oil and gas. We want to talk about innovation with technology, and digital technologies in particular is what I want to talk about. Just to categorize various ways that digital technologies can create efficiencies, long life of the field, reduce costs, or improve environmental performance, I like to just segregate it into 3 quick buckets, right? One is on the surface, where there's significant rotating equipment, pipes, pumps, valves, compressors, and so forth. Lots of machine learning technologies are available for that part of the chain, and we'll talk about one here shortly. Wells themselves have sensors and create data, of course, and the reservoir technologists as well as data scientists are trying to mine that data to find ways to optimize production well by well. But the mother lode, I think, is at the reservoir, which is what I'll spend a little bit of time on in a few moments, because as we've talked about, both Mike and Bob, we don't get all the oil out of the reservoir. So if there are ways to get an extra handful of percent, the gearing effect on company performance and capital efficiency and so forth is remarkable. Okay, so surface operations, wells, and the reservoir. So we'll start with one on the surface, and this one has to do with environmental and safety, which is something I'm passionate about, as I suspect you are as well. We had a client that had done a lot of work to collect data on spills, on reportable events. And they wanted to use that data to learn, to avoid, to anticipate, to prevent future spills. And so they collected the data and they sorted it out by what was the substance that we're spilling, what work process was involved, how can we learn from that, what was the cause, was it operator error, was it a technical failure, was it an equipment failure, and they learned a lot from the data set just in terms of kind of what happened and why. That's what's on the left-hand side of this chart. But what they didn't get any information on is how do you anticipate, predict, or prevent a future event, right? And is there something that we can learn from the data to help us anticipate future events? Because we weren't able to do it with our typical knowledge management, learning, and continuous improvement process. So what we did, I'm going to say this slightly tongue-in-cheek, we used a simple machine learning classifier. When we say simple machine learning classifier, it doesn't mean I know how to do it, because I clearly do not. But I will say most of your data scientists, most of our data scientists, would be able to pull off, almost off the shelf, tools that help you classify and sort data that's available to see what drives, what creates correlations, and what actually can be tied to causality. And what we did is we took many hundreds of events, and we looked at the entire data set that was generated by these wells and these pads, and identified not only the data that was sort of associated with events in the future, but then the rates of change of data, the data relationships between one indicator and another, flow tubing pressure here, flow tubing pressure the next day, flow tubing pressure, casing pressure, top quartile, bottom quartile. And the machine learning just classifies all that data until you get some set of predictive correlations on what was driving what. And using sanitized data here, the results were remarkable for both us and for our clients. The ability to predict at the well level a future event one day in advance was 88%. So of 25 events, 22 of them were actually predicted accurately. We did have 11% false positives, so you were expecting something that actually didn't happen. That's expected. 64% of the time, when you didn't expect something to happen, nothing happened. So only 3% false negatives. What's even more remarkable is looking 7 days ahead, the results were almost as good. 77% predictive accuracy with this particular classifier, with that data set that they had deployed on those wells. So machine learning, sensors, data technology can provide a real impact on safety and environment. There were similar results at the pad level, and of course now they're rolling this kind of analysis out across their system. So a really good example of what I would call standard machine learning with standard data sets. Okay. Now we'll go downhole and look at the reservoir. And we're going to talk a little bit about something that we call digital oil recovery. And full disclosure, we are in a partnership or an alliance with a company called 4Oil, who is a French company staffed by mathematicians, physicists, computer scientists, and reservoir engineers. They got their history modeling neutron flow in a nuclear fuel for the defense industry. And so I guess once you've modeled nuclear defense, nuclear weapons, you kind of stop and you say, okay, what's the next big challenge we want to take on? And so they took on the challenge of conventional brownfield oil and gas reservoirs. So this is conventional primarily what we're talking about. And what they realized was the techniques that the reservoir engineers use today have a fundamental limitation in terms of their ability to forecast future production based on changes in the dynamics of the reservoir. And so using the knowledge that they had from the defense industry, they said, what if we had the whole production data set for a mature field? So we have 20 years, we have 20 or more wells, we know what was produced every month, by phase, by well. Data's not perfect, but it doesn't need to be. We know where the completions were. We don't really know what the geology is, but we know what all the production dynamics were. Further, because we're physicists, we understand that the flow of fluid through a reservoir rock is governed by these laws of reservoir physics, and we understand those too. So what we want to do, and what they do, is they combine historical measured data with the equations of reservoir physics to generate models. And they create a whole solution space of models, and they basically, to use a vernacular, upscale them and downscale them until they get to a model that has a combination of the right scale and a history match, good old-fashioned history match. Okay? The importance of the scale is, if you look at the upper right, there's a theory, which I guess is a theorem, called the Batnik-Chervenkis theorem of statistical learning theory, that states if you have a model that's governed by actual physics, and you build the model at the proper level of complexity, and you have a history match, you can create a model that has an upper bound to its forecast error. In other words, it's accurate. It has forecast accuracy. If you look at the bottom right, what we see in the many blind tests with the technology is that if you look at historical production and then take a blind test at that point, build a model, then the client tells you what wells they drilled, what wells they recomplete, what wells they shut in, how they change the water flood pattern, and so forth. The model can forecast future production years in the future very, very accurately, which is something your traditional reservoir models struggle with. So, what's the big deal? We can forecast. What does that really do for us? Well, the other thing that these good mathematicians have figured out is if I have a model that can forecast accurately, even when you do multiple things in the field in the future, now wouldn't it be cool if I could run tens of thousands or millions or even tens of millions of potential field development plans, knowing my forecast is accurate, and see which one optimizes reservoir results. And so being the mathematicians and knowing that this is a difficult optimization problem to resolve, it's got linear elements, it's got discrete elements, they built and patented a hybrid optimizer that uses 10,000 machines in parallel to run 15 million fully calculated field development scenarios overnight. They use the client's objectives, the client's constraints. So if you only want to spend $20 million in the field, that's a constraint. If you have certain water handling limits on the platform, that's a constraint. If you want to optimize NPV, that's what we optimize. If you want to optimize ultimate recovery over 15 years, that's what we optimize. Okay. To them, it's a relatively straightforward mathematical problem because they figured it out. But that's what they do. So 2 case studies on the right-hand side. And very briefly, the first one is one where the client said, I do not have any capital to spend. So help me optimize this field. Had 80-some wells and many zones and significant production history. What they ended up doing was altering the water flood injection and production rates on probably 60 of the wells. They converted 6 or 7, I think it was 7, producers to injectors, and they got a 20% increase in production. The whole process took about 4 months. They got a 20% increase in production. The reserves were actually recertified, so we weren't just accelerating production, we were actually sweeping better, producing more. Okay. That particular operator said, you know, there's this one sand that we never injected. We don't really know how it's going to work. And we said, well, we can't tell you how it's going to work because we're a machine learning technique, and the machine needs to learn from history. So they said, what if we run about 18 or 20 months of injecting into this more virgin